Hi, I'm Underbelly, and you suck at producing. Today, we're gonna learn how to create insanely loud mixes in Ableton. Sounds like this. Wowzers. This song is called Turtleneck Training, and it's off my new EP, Mental Kill. You can check out the full song in the video description. Anyways, let's get started. Okay, so check it. My first tip for creating insanely loud mixes is to even out the volume of each sound as much as possible. So for example, if I take a look at my drop drums, you can see that there's a pretty big difference between the peak loudness, which is the transparent grain, and the average loudness, which is the solid grain. So to reduce the peaks, I'm going to use a saturator, and I'm going to switch it to the digital clip mode. This simulates basically going into the red on a track in Ableton. What I'm going to do is crank the drive a ridiculous amount and turn the output down the same amount so that the volume is about the same overall. So now let's take a look at the peak value with the saturator on and off. This is off, -17. And this is on. Oh my gosh, it's all the way down to -25. That's crazy. If you repeat that process on basically every single track, your mix will be ready for an ultra loud master. Now, my next tip has to do with the low end of the track. Basically, we want to cut as much low end from every single track as possible to make room for the kick and sub. Now, if I take a look at my chords group here, you can see on my dreamy chords, I have quite a bit of mud down there if I cut it out. It's a subtle effect, but it really cleans up things for the bass later on. And then once I've cleaned it up, I can go to my sub, and it's really hard to tell exactly how much sub you need if you're just listening on shitty Apple earbuds. So what I like to do is go to the master track and put a spectrum. This way I can visualize exactly how much low end my track has. I can even zoom in on the sub by clicking auto. And messing with these sliders here. So that looks like to be about where my sub is peaking, but how much sub is the right amount? Well, what we can do is check against reference tracks to see exactly how much booty bass our track needs. So for example, here I have a reference track of a similar style. And what we first want to do is match the overall loudness of the reference track to our track. So I'm going to turn on this Yuli loudness meter here. This measures the loudness in LUFS, and that's the unit of measurement we're going to pay attention to here. So I'm going to play my track and see how loud the integrated LUFS gets. I'm gonna hit X to reset. Looks like it's around 30. And if we take a look at the reference track, slightly louder, let's turn it down a bit. Okay, so that looks to be at about the same loudness. So what we're going to do is check out the spectrum and visualize how much sub our track has versus the reference. So there's our sub. And let's take a look at the reference. So it's actually pretty close, maybe a little bit lower. So now we know our sub is at about the right level, but here's the sitch. The reference track sub just cuts through the mix way more. So one thing we could do to allow that to happen is go to whatever we're making our sub on. I'm using Sweet Serum here. And instead of just using a basic sine wave, we can go into the wavetable editor and draw in some harmonics. Just sounds way fatter. You can also change the phase of the harmonics. Then what I like to do is turn on the filter and crank the drive. Really bring out those harmonics. Now the next thing I like to do these chords. Now, if we go back to my drums, one thing I've tried to do is make the drum sounds as short as possible so that they get out of the way of the other elements as quickly as they can. So for example, if I take a look at my kick, it's only about 100 milliseconds long. And to make sure that the other elements duck out of the way whenever the kick does hit, one thing I like to do is have extremely heavy sidechain on everything except for the drums. So if you take a look at my group here, I got this super fat sidechain compressor that's just ducking it all out of the way. Now what I'm doing is I'm using a sidechain input ghost. This is just white noise. It doesn't actually play in the track. It just triggers the Ableton compressor to duck everything out of the way. The benefit of using the sidechain input is that I can really accurately control how long the ducking effect goes on for. If I just mess with the release, I can make it longer or shorter. I usually like it pretty short, just enough for the kick to cut through, but not so much that you really notice it in the mix. With so few elements playing at a time, it really helps to add a bunch of detail to the elements that you do have. So for example, all I have is a sine wave, and what I'm doing to create that super glitchy effect is automating the chorus pitch up and down. If I hit show automation, you can see all that happening. And just to make the sound a bit brighter and more interesting, I'm drawing in these harmonics here. To create a bit more movement in the sound, I'm using the filter on the bandpass setting. I've cranked the filter drive so that there's a bunch of distortion happening here. In terms of effects, I'm using the grain delay to widen the sound and create this octave pitch up effect. Next, I've added serum effects to widen up the sound. And then I'm using this really cool effect made by my boy Eli Dirt. Basically, it reduces the sound to a set number of harmonics that you can manipulate here. And the way it creates that wobbly effect is by messing with the time. So just a little bit of that goes a long way. Next, I'm adding OTT to squash the sound. And I'm using the frequency shifter with a little bit of dry wet at 100%. It kind of creates this big crushing effect. You can mess with that using the frequency. And if you just add a little bit of that, it kind of creates this extra bit of crispiness to the sound. To reduce some of the harshness, I'm using Soothe to cut out the resonances. And then I'm using OTT again to squash the shit out of it. Once you've done all of the above, all the things that we've talked about in your mix, the mastering should be a breeze. So I'm adding the saturator first on that digital clip setting. It's the same idea as the drums, it's just there to cut the peaks out. Next up, we got multi-band compression. I like this as sort of an alternative to an EQ because I can mess with the low, mid, and high independently while squeezing each independently as well. So you can see I'm cranking up the low end a bunch. Next I got Ozone EQ, just boosting the high end a little bit, making it a little bit brighter. And then last but not least, I got not one, but two Fab Filter Pro Ls, just cranking the shit out of the mix. I noticed if I'd used just one, it would start to distort very quickly, but if I distribute the work among two different limiters, it actually sounds a lot better. And that's how I create insanely loud mixes in my songs. Wowzers.